The moment she screamed, "This is community property," I realized half the neighborhood had been invited to a lake they had never owned. The heavy chain rattled through my hands as I pulled the steel gate shut, the old padlock snapping closed with a sharp metallic click that echoed across the still morning water. Mist floated just above the surface of the lake, turning gold beneath the first rays of the Texas sunrise, while the scent of damp cedar, fresh mud, and clean freshwater filled the cool air. Somewhere along the shoreline, a largemouth bass broke the surface with a quiet splash before disappearing beneath the mirror-like water. That peaceful sound lasted exactly 3 seconds before a line of oversized sport utility vehicles rolled down the gravel road toward my entrance. Tires crunched over limestone, engines idled, doors opened one after another, and suddenly nearly 30 strangers stepped out carrying fishing rods, coolers, folding chairs, picnic baskets, inflatable kayaks, and enough barbecue supplies to feed an entire block party. Children laughed as they raced toward the locked entrance, while adults looked around with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be there. I stood beside the gate wearing an old canvas work jacket over my flannel shirt, my boots still damp from checking the dock before sunrise, one hand resting calmly on the chain stretched across the entrance. Nobody recognized me at first. To them, I was simply another man standing in front of a lake. Then a white luxury sport utility vehicle stopped near the front of the convoy. The driver's door opened slowly, and Linda Crawford stepped onto the gravel with the polished confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in her favor. Even from 20 feet away, I caught the sharp scent of expensive perfume drifting through the cool morning breeze, oddly out of place against the smell of pine trees and fresh water. She adjusted her sunglasses, smiled at the waiting crowd, then walked directly toward me without slowing down. "Good morning," she said pleasantly enough. "You can open the gate now. Our residents have been looking forward to this fishing social for weeks." I looked past her toward the growing crowd gathering behind the fence. Some people had already unfolded lawn chairs. A teenage boy balanced a tackle box on his shoulder, while an older couple pointed excitedly toward the wooden dock extending into the water. None of them looked nervous. None of them looked like trespassers. They looked like invited guests because that was exactly what they believed they were. I shook my head once. "I cannot do that." Linda frowned slightly as if she had misheard me. "Excuse me." I tightened the lock one final time before slipping the key into my pocket. "This lake is private property. Nobody enters without my permission." Her smile disappeared so quickly it almost seemed rehearsed. She stepped closer, lifted a neatly printed community newsletter, and pointed toward a colorful advertisement announcing the Maple Ridge Family Fishing Weekend. My lake filled the background photograph. My dock, my shoreline. Even my old fishing cabin appeared in the corner of the picture. "You are mistaken," she said loudly enough for everyone behind her to hear. "This lake belongs to the community." Conversations around us stopped almost instantly. Dozens of eyes shifted back and forth between us while a light breeze rippled across the water behind my shoulder. I looked at the newsletter, then at the crowd, then back at Linda. She truly believed every word she was saying. What she did not know was that my family's name had appeared on the original property deed for that lake long before the first street inside Maple Ridge had ever been paved, and every single person waiting behind that locked gate was about to discover the difference between what an HOA claimed to own and what the county records actually said. Nobody behind that gate understood why I remained so calm. They expected an argument. They expected raised voices, angry gestures, or dramatic threats. Instead, I simply rested one hand on the cold steel chain while the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh water and wild grass across the shoreline. The lake had a way of slowing everything down. Even now, with dozens of impatient strangers staring at me, I could still hear the gentle creak of the old wooden dock and the distant chatter of red-winged blackbirds hidden among the reeds. I had been listening to those sounds for most of my life. My father bought this property almost 30 years before Maple Ridge existed. Back then, the county road was little more than packed gravel winding through cattle pastures and oak trees. The lake was not advertised in glossy real estate brochures or featured on neighborhood websites. It was simply a quiet stretch of water tucked between rolling hills where my father escaped after long weeks working construction jobs across Central Texas. He used to tell me that fish did not care how much money someone had, what kind of truck they drove, or where they lived. The lake treated everyone the same, provided they respected it. Every Saturday morning we launched a small aluminum fishing boat before sunrise. The smell of old outboard fuel mixed with fresh coffee drifting from his thermos while mist floated low across the water. Sometimes we caught bass. Sometimes we caught nothing at all. Neither outcome mattered very much because those mornings were never really about fishing. They were about learning patience. He taught me how to repair weathered dock boards, replace damaged fence posts, monitor water levels during dry summers, and keep invasive plants from spreading along the shoreline. Every improvement happened slowly, one weekend at a time. We planted native trees where erosion threatened the banks. We built nesting platforms for local birds. We stocked the lake responsibly with guidance from state wildlife biologists. We even restored an old fishing cabin that had nearly collapsed after years of neglect. None of it happened because someone required us to do it. We simply believe that if you own something beautiful, you carried the responsibility to leave it better than you found it. After my father passed away, I inherited not only the land, but also the habits he had built into my life. Every morning before work, I walked the shoreline collecting litter that floated in after storms, checked the dock supports, inspected the spillway, and watched the fish feeding near the shallow coves. I knew every fallen cedar, every submerged stump, every rocky point where bass gathered during early spring. The lake was not an investment property to me. It was part of my family's history. When Maple Ridge eventually appeared on the neighboring land, I welcomed many of the new families. Some waved while walking nearby trails. Others asked polite questions about local wildlife or admired the old fishing cabin from a distance. I never minded friendly neighbors because respect always opens more gates than conflict ever will. What I never expected was for someone to begin treating private property as though years of careful stewardship could simply be rewritten by a neighborhood newsletter. Standing there beside the locked entrance, watching dozens of strangers waiting for instructions from someone who had never owned a single inch of the shoreline, I realized they were not the real problem. They had trusted the invitation they received. The real problem was that somebody had confidently promised access to a place she had never taken the time to understand. Looking back, I realized Linda Crawford had never actually asked who owned the lake. She had simply decided. Somewhere between organizing neighborhood cookouts and enforcing mailbox regulations, she convinced herself that anything beautiful near Maple Ridge naturally belonged to Maple Ridge. The first time she approached me about the property was almost 2 years before that Saturday morning at the locked gate. I was repairing loose boards on the fishing dock when I heard the quiet hum of an electric golf cart coming down the gravel driveway. She stepped out wearing spotless white sneakers that somehow never seemed to collect dust, carrying a welcoming smile and a folder embossed with the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association logo. At first, the conversation felt perfectly pleasant. She complimented the lake, admired the fishing cabin, and commented on how peaceful everything looked beneath the towering oak trees. Sunlight reflected across the calm water, while turtles rested on an old fallen log near the opposite shoreline. Even the breeze seemed relaxed that afternoon. Then she glanced toward the dock and said something that caught my attention immediately. Our residents would absolutely love having access to a place like this. I smiled politely and explained that it was private property maintained entirely by my family. She nodded as though she understood, thanked me for my time, and drove away. I assumed that ended the conversation. It did not. A few weeks later, I noticed photographs of my lake appearing in the neighborhood newsletter advertising the area's natural beauty. Nobody had asked permission to use those pictures. Then came social media posts encouraging residents to explore the scenic waterfront near the subdivision. The wording carefully avoided claiming ownership, but it strongly suggested the lake was part of the community's outdoor lifestyle. I shrugged it off at first because very few people actually wandered toward my property. Most stayed on public roads, admired the view, and continued home. Things changed after Linda became president of the association. Almost overnight, every neighborhood event became larger, louder, and more ambitious. Holiday gatherings expanded. Food truck nights appeared. Family festivals filled the clubhouse parking lot. Then one monthly newsletter announced exciting future recreational opportunities, accompanied once again by another photograph of my dock stretching into the lake beneath a brilliant Texas sunset. My dock, my shoreline, my fishing cabin. Not once did anyone contact me. Not once did anyone ask whether the images represented private land. During a county planning meeting several months later, I overheard Linda speaking confidently with several residents near the entrance. She pointed toward my property on a large aerial map and casually referred to the lake as one of Maple Ridge's greatest neighborhood assets. Those words stayed with me. Assets. It was an interesting choice because an asset usually belongs to the person paying taxes, maintaining insurance, repairing storm damage, replacing docks, stocking fish, clearing fallen trees, and monitoring erosion every season. Every one of those responsibilities had belonged to my family for decades. None had ever belonged to the association. Still, Linda carried herself with such certainty that nobody questioned her. Confidence has a strange way of sounding like authority when people stop asking for proof. By the time invitations for the community fishing weekend were printed, I finally understood what had happened. She had repeated the same assumption often enough that everyone around her accepted it as fact. The families arriving that morning were not trying to ignore private property. They honestly believed they had been invited to a neighborhood amenity. Standing quietly behind the locked gate, I could almost feel the weight of that misunderstanding settling across the crowd. Because while Linda had spent months building expectations with colorful newsletters and cheerful promises, I had something far less exciting but infinitely more powerful waiting in a file cabinet inside my farmhouse. The crowd outside my gate did not disappear after Linda's announcement. If anything, they grew even more confident. Several families unfolded picnic blankets along the county road while children pointed excitedly toward the dock, asking their parents when they could start fishing. Someone unloaded a bright red kayak from the roof of a sport utility vehicle. Another man carried a portable grill toward the entrance before noticing the heavy chain stretched across it. The smell of charcoal lighter fluid mixed strangely with the fresh scent of lake water and pine needles drifting through the morning air. It looked less like a property dispute and more like a neighborhood festival that had arrived at the wrong address. Linda turned back toward the waiting residents and lifted both hands with the reassuring smile of someone promising that a minor inconvenience would soon disappear. "Give us just a minute," she called. "We are sorting out a misunderstanding." Then she faced me again, lowering her voice just enough that only the two of us could hear clearly. "Nathan, you are making this much harder than it needs to be. These are good families. They only want to enjoy the lake for one weekend." I looked past her toward the shoreline where sunlight reflected across the water in long ribbons of gold. A great blue heron lifted gracefully from the reeds before gliding toward the opposite bank, completely unaware that dozens of people were waiting to occupy its quiet morning fishing grounds. "This is not about one weekend," I answered. "It is about permission." She folded her arms and sighed with visible frustration. "You live beside an entire community. Sometimes being a good neighbor means sharing." I nodded slowly because I actually agreed with part of what she had said. My family had spent years sharing this place with invited guests, local wildlife students, conservation volunteers, and even nearby landowners who always asked before bringing their children to fish. Respect had never been the problem. Assumption was. Before I could respond again, one of the homeowners walked toward us carrying a tackle box. He looked genuinely confused rather than angry. "Excuse me," he asked politely. "The newsletter said today's event was approved. Is something wrong?" I smiled at him because none of this was his fault. "You were invited here by someone who does not own the property." His eyes shifted toward Linda, then back to me, uncertainty replacing the excitement he had arrived with only minutes earlier. Around us, quiet conversations began spreading through the crowd. People looked at the gate, then at the lake, then back toward the colorful flyers many still carried in their hands. Linda quickly stepped forward before the questions could grow louder. She held up the printed newsletter again, pointing toward the photograph of my dock beneath the bold event announcement. "Everything was coordinated through the association," she declared confidently. "This has always been presented as a neighborhood amenity." I studied the glossy page for another moment. The picture had been taken from the eastern shoreline during autumn, probably with a telephoto lens from the public road. It was beautifully framed. It was also carefully cropped to hide every private property sign, standing only a few yards outside the image. That detail told me more than anything else. Somebody had deliberately chosen the one angle that made my lake appear to belong to everyone. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the familiar shape of a small brass key resting beside another item I always carried whenever questions about the property surfaced. Folded neatly inside a waterproof document sleeve was a certified copy of something far less colorful than a community newsletter, but infinitely more important. While Linda continued assuring the growing crowd that the association would resolve everything within minutes, I already knew the only document that mattered had never been printed by the Homeowners Association in the first place. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The only sounds came from the soft waves tapping against the dock, the distant buzz of cicadas waking with the morning sun, and the occasional clink of fishing lures hanging from rods people still believed they would use that day. Linda looked around at the growing crowd as though expecting someone else to settle the matter for her. Instead, every question eventually found its way back to me. A gray-haired man, wearing an old fishing cap, stepped forward first. "Sir," he asked politely, "if this really is your property, why would the association advertise an event here?" His voice carried genuine confusion instead of accusation. I understood exactly how he felt. "That is a question you should ask the person who invited you," I answered calmly. Linda immediately interrupted before anyone could respond. "We have every reason to believe this area serves the community," she insisted. "The neighborhood has always considered this lake part of our shared recreational space." I noticed the way she chose her words carefully. She no longer said she owned the lake. She said the neighborhood considered it theirs. There is a very important difference between believing something and proving it. She reached into her leather portfolio and removed several printed pages. They were copies of neighborhood maps showing walking trails, landscaped common areas, and decorative green spaces surrounding Maple Ridge. She placed one against the hood of a nearby sport utility vehicle and pointed toward a large blue shape representing the lake. "See," she said confidently to the residents gathered around her. "It is right here beside the subdivision." I stepped closer and studied the page for a moment. It was professionally designed with colorful icons, winding sidewalks, picnic symbols, and shaded parks. What it was not was a legal survey. There were no property boundaries, no parcel numbers, no bearings, no recorded easements, no county references. It was a marketing illustration, nothing more. "This is a neighborhood brochure," I said quietly. "It is not a property record." The expressions on several faces began to change. A younger couple looked down at the map again as though noticing its missing details for the first time. One father slowly lowered the fishing rod he had been holding across his shoulder. Even the children, sensing the mood around the adults, stopped running near the entrance and stood quietly beside their parents. Linda's confidence started showing small cracks. She quickly suggested calling the county sheriff, convinced an official badge would force me to unlock the gate. I simply nodded. "You are welcome to call." About 30 minutes later, a deputy arrived in a marked patrol truck, gravel crunching beneath the tires as he parked beside the entrance. He listened carefully while Linda explained that I was preventing residents from accessing what she described as neighborhood property. Then he turned toward me and asked a single question. "Do you claim ownership of the land beyond this gate?" "Yes, sir," I answered. "I do." He nodded once. "Do you have documentation?" I rested my hand against my jacket pocket where the waterproof document sleeve remained exactly where it had been all morning. "Not with me," I replied honestly. "The originals are secured inside my farmhouse less than 200 yards from here." The deputy glanced at the locked gate, then back toward the waiting crowd. His calm expression never changed. "Until ownership is verified," he said, "this is a civil property matter. Nobody should enter disputed private land without permission." Linda looked stunned. She had expected the deputy to order me aside. Instead, everyone remained exactly where they had been when the morning began. The gate stayed locked. The chain stayed in place. The lake remained perfectly still behind it. I looked toward the farmhouse where an old fireproof filing cabinet sat quietly inside my study. Hidden within it was the original deed, the recorded boundary survey, and decades of county records that had never once needed to defend themselves before today. They had simply been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The deputy remained beside the gate while I walked back toward the farmhouse alone. Gravel crunched beneath my boots with every step, and the familiar scent of sun-warmed cedar drifted through the still air. Behind me, conversations continued in low voices as families waited without knowing exactly what they were waiting for anymore. Nobody unpacked another fishing rod. Nobody carried another cooler toward the entrance. Curiosity had quietly replaced certainty. Inside the farmhouse, everything felt exactly as it had every morning for years. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Sunlight spilled across worn hardwood floors polished smooth by generations of footsteps. I unlocked the fireproof filing cabinet tucked inside my study and pulled out a thick leather folder my father had labeled years earlier in careful block letters. Lake property. The paper inside carried the unmistakable scent of old archives and faded ink. Original warranty deed. Certified boundary survey. County plat map. Annual tax records. Every document had been preserved inside waterproof sleeves because my father believed that if land mattered enough to protect, its history deserved the same care. I gathered everything into a canvas document case before walking back outside. The morning had grown warmer, and dragonflies now skimmed across the calm water beyond the gate. The deputy accepted the folder with quiet professionalism and opened the first document against the hood of his patrol truck. He read slowly, turning each page with deliberate care instead of rushing to conclusions. Linda stepped closer, trying to follow along, while several homeowners respectfully kept their distance. The deputy unfolded the original survey until the large sheet stretched nearly the width of the truck hood. Black property lines surrounded the entire lake. Parcel numbers matched the county records. Boundary markers extended well beyond the shoreline, enclosing every dock, every fishing pier, every section of water visible from where we stood. He compared the survey with the deed, then with the current county tax statement listing my name exactly where it belonged. Finally, he looked up at me. "Mr. Brooks, these documents appear complete and properly recorded." He turned toward Linda with the same calm tone he had used all morning. "Ma'am, based on the documentation presented, this property is privately owned." A long silence settled across the entrance. The breeze rustled oak leaves overhead, while gentle waves tapped against the empty dock. Linda blinked several times before reaching into her portfolio again. She handed the deputy the colorful neighborhood brochure she had relied upon since the beginning of the dispute. He studied it for only a few seconds before handing it back. "This is a promotional map," he explained politely. "It does not establish ownership." I watched several residents exchange surprised glances. One older gentleman removed his fishing hat and quietly apologized to me for the misunderstanding. A young mother folded the event flyer and slipped it into her purse without saying a word. None of them appeared angry. Most simply looked disappointed that they had trusted information which had never been verified. Linda remained unusually quiet as the deputy finished returning my documents. Before leaving, he offered one final observation that carried more weight than any argument either of us could have made. Property boundaries are determined by recorded county records, not community assumptions. I thanked him, carefully returned every document to the canvas case, and looked once more across the peaceful lake shimmering beneath the bright Texas sun. The truth had never been hidden. It had simply been sitting inside an old filing cabinet, waiting for the day someone finally cared enough to read it. After the deputy drove away, the crowd slowly began loading coolers back into their vehicles. Nobody argued. Nobody demanded another explanation. Reality has a way of settling over people once the facts become impossible to ignore. The only person still standing near the locked gate was Linda. She remained unusually still, holding the folded neighborhood brochure in one hand while staring across the quiet lake that had looked so different only an hour earlier. The confidence she had carried into my driveway had disappeared, replaced by the expression of someone mentally retracing every decision that had brought her there. I slipped the certified documents back into their waterproof sleeves, locked them inside the canvas case, and returned the folder to the passenger seat of my pickup truck. I had no interest in celebrating. Winning an argument had never been my goal. Protecting the property my father trusted me to preserve had always been the only objective. Before climbing into their vehicles, several residents walked over to me one by one. A father whose son had carried a fishing rod earlier apologized for believing the event announcement without asking questions. An older couple thanked me for remaining patient throughout the morning. Another homeowner admitted they had always assumed the lake belonged to the neighborhood because everyone kept saying it did. I shook every hand and told them the same thing. "You were invited here in good faith. This was never your mistake." Their disappointment was understandable. They had planned family memories around information they believed was accurate. As the last sport utility vehicle disappeared down the county road, only Linda and I remained beside the entrance. The breeze carried the fresh scent of water lilies drifting from the shallow cove, while a pair of ducks glided silently across the lake beyond the dock. Finally, she looked toward me and spoke more quietly than I had ever heard before. I genuinely believed the association had access. I nodded because, by then, I believed she was telling the truth. Believing something does not make it part of the county records, I answered gently. She looked down at the colorful brochure still folded in her hand before letting out a slow breath. I should have verified everything before inviting the neighborhood. That simple sentence changed the entire conversation. There was no shouting, no accusations, no dramatic confrontation, just an honest acknowledgement that assumptions had replaced facts. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the association. Instead of another demand, it contained a formal notice canceling every future event scheduled at the lake until ownership questions had been fully reviewed by the board and their attorney. Later that same week, another letter arrived requesting a meeting to discuss correcting community maps, newsletters, and promotional materials that inaccurately suggested public access to my property. I accepted because solving problems has always interested me more than prolonging them. Before attending the meeting, I installed one additional sign beside the gate. It was simple, professionally made, and impossible to misunderstand. Private fishing lake. Access by owner permission only. I also mounted 2 discrete security cameras overlooking the entrance, not because I expected more trouble, but because clear records often prevent future misunderstandings before they begin. Every improvement stayed well within the law, every notice remained respectful, and every step focused on preventing confusion rather than creating conflict. Standing beside the newly installed sign that evening, listening to crickets beginning their nightly chorus while the last sunlight shimmered across the still water, I realized the gate had never been about keeping good people out. It had always been about making sure the truth stayed in. The association meeting took place the following Thursday evening inside the Maple Ridge Clubhouse, a building I had driven past countless times but had never entered until then. The smell of fresh coffee and newly printed paper lingered in the meeting room, while quiet conversations faded as I walked through the front door, carrying the same canvas document case that had settled everything at the gate. Around the long conference table sat Linda, every member of the association board, their attorney, and a licensed county surveyor invited specifically to review the property records. Large aerial maps covered one wall beside a projection screen displaying parcel boundaries instead of decorative neighborhood illustrations. For the first time since this entire situation began, nobody was discussing opinions. Every conversation centered on recorded facts. The county surveyor spoke first. Using official parcel maps, he traced every boundary line with a laser pointer, carefully explaining how the subdivision stopped several hundred feet before reaching my shoreline. Then he displayed the original recorded plat, followed by the certified survey matching the documents I had presented days earlier. The room remained completely silent except for the quiet hum of the projector. Linda watched every page without interrupting. The attorney eventually cleared his throat and admitted that the association had relied upon promotional materials rather than recorded county documents when advertising recreational access. Hearing those words changed the atmosphere instantly. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable looks before asking how such an obvious mistake had gone unnoticed for so many years. The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. Every new newsletter had reused the same marketing artwork created during the subdivision's early development. Every community brochure copied the previous edition. Every website update repeated the same assumption without anyone comparing it against county records. A mistake repeated often enough had slowly become accepted as truth. I opened my document case only once, placing the original deed, boundary survey, and tax records on the table so everyone could compare them directly with the county files already displayed on the screen. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No emotional speeches. No celebration. Just page after page confirming exactly what had always existed. By the end of the meeting, the board voted unanimously to remove every reference suggesting community ownership or public recreational access to the lake. Future newsletters would be corrected. Digital maps would be updated. Event advertisements would be withdrawn. Linda herself volunteered to sign a formal letter acknowledging the error and apologizing for the confusion caused to both residents and my family. I accepted the letter without asking for anything more because repairing trust mattered far more than collecting apologies. As the meeting ended, several board members thanked the county surveyor for clarifying the records before thanking me for approaching the situation with patience instead of anger. Walking back outside beneath a sky filled with bright Texas stars, I noticed the familiar smell of freshly cut grass drifting across the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere in the distance while porch lights glowed along quiet streets. It struck me that nothing about Maple Ridge itself had ever been my enemy. The neighborhood was full of decent families simply trying to enjoy where they lived. The real problem had always been allowing assumptions to replace verification. That night, for the first time since the locked gate changed everything, everyone involved finally understood exactly where the property lines ended, where respect began, and why the two should never be separated. Autumn arrived a few weeks later, bringing cool mornings, clear skies, and the familiar sound of leaves drifting across the surface of the lake. Sunrise painted the water with soft shades of gold, while a thin layer of mist floated quietly above the shoreline exactly the way it had every fall since I was a boy. I unlocked the gate just after dawn, not because anyone had demanded access, but because an old friend from the neighboring ranch had called the night before to ask if he could bring his grandson fishing. He asked permission first, just as my father always believed good neighbors should. By the time they reached the dock, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the crisp scent of cedar and clean freshwater, while bass occasionally broke the calm surface beneath overhanging branches. Everything felt exactly the way this place was supposed to feel. A few days after the association meeting, Maple Ridge mailed corrected newsletters to every homeowner. The inaccurate maps disappeared from the community website, the promotional photographs were replaced, and every reference suggesting public access to the lake was removed. The board also adopted a simple policy requiring county property records to be verified before any future community event involving neighboring land. It sounded like common sense because it was. Sometimes the most valuable lesson is simply learning to check the facts before making assumptions. Linda kept her promise as well. One afternoon, she stopped by alone, parked beside the entrance, and walked to the gate carrying nothing except a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note thanking my family for maintaining the lake through the years and apologizing for allowing confidence to replace verification. She did not ask to come inside. She did not request another meeting. She simply handed me the note, wished me a good afternoon, and quietly returned to her vehicle. It was a brief conversation, but somehow it carried more sincerity than every argument that had come before it. I folded the note and placed it inside the same leather folder that held the original deed, the survey, and the county records. In its own way, it had become part of the property's history too. The new sign beside the entrance remained exactly where I installed it. Private fishing lake. Access by owner permission only. Most people slowed down long enough to read it before continuing along the county road. Occasionally, someone stopped to admire the view or ask whether they could fish one weekend with their family. If they asked respectfully, we usually found a day that worked. My father had always believed ownership and generosity could exist together as long as one never replaced the other. Standing on the dock that quiet morning, I watched the first fishing line of the day disappear beneath the glassy surface, while the old wooden boards creaked softly beneath my boots. Somewhere behind me, a kingfisher called from the tallest oak tree, and gentle ripples spread across the lake until they faded into perfect stillness once again. Looking back, I realized the dispute had never really been about a gate, a newsletter, or even a fishing lake. It had been about something much simpler. Respect begins with asking instead of assuming. Property rights begin with records instead of rumors. Good neighbors begin with honesty instead of entitlement. The lake never changed throughout any of it. The water remained calm. The fish continued swimming beneath the surface. The sunrise arrived every morning without caring who believed what. In the end, the only thing that truly changed was that everyone finally understood where the shoreline ended, where responsibility began, and why the quiet truth recorded on a single county deed will always outlast the loudest opinion. Justice does not always arrive with sirens or courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives with a locked gate, an old document, a peaceful morning on the water, and the patience to let the facts speak for themselves.